that today's event is being live streamed as well. So that really opens up Spotlight to audiences right across Ireland, and for more people to get a chance to engage with the proceedings this morning are people who might not be able to make all of the day and attend some of it online. So it's great that we're managing to hold on to a bit of what happened over the last 2 years, but ultimately to have people back in the room to really have a good conversation. An event like this obviously takes a lot of people, so I'd like to thank all of the various teams at the IFI who worked so hard in putting this together. I'd like to thank Oliver Nolan, our box office manager, and all the team from his team who are here working away today to make sure it's working well, Casey and Afra in particular. I'd like to thank the whole marketing team, led by Frances over there in the corner and Casey behind her, beside her, and then Penny and Nia up the back looking after the live streaming element this morning. So thank you to everyone involved in all of that. And a huge thank you to Suneva O'Flynn, our head of Irish film programming, for curating today's event and all of the wonderful speakers that you'll get to hear over the course of the day. So huge thanks to Suneva for that. I'd also like to thank the Arts Council. They're our principal funder. I'd like to thank them for all of their ongoing support of all of our activities across exhibition, preservation and education. I'm delighted that Fanula, Audrey and Maretta are here with us today. So thanks very much for coming along, and great to see you. So thank you to everyone. Thank you to all of you to coming back into the IFI for today's event. Just to let you know the sort of proceedings for today. The first session will be kicking off directly after this introduction. Then we'll be following that later on with music into film, a panel looking at music composition in film. That'll be followed by Gail Force, a panel looking at the wonderful surge in Irish language feature filmmaking at the moment. Then we'll have a break for lunch until around 2:30, and then we'll come back with two final panels. The D&I is cast, which will be chaired by Dr. Susan Liddy. And then our keynote address by Malachy Brown, the New York Times investigative journalist, doing the keynote address this afternoon to close things out. So I hope you'll enjoy many or some or all of those sessions during the course of the day. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to two of our staples of IFI Spotlight at this stage. And a huge thank you to Drs. Tony Tracy and Roddy Flynn for doing the first session, looking back at the year in review. So without further ado, I will hand over to you both, and thank you, gents.
Thanks very much, Ross, and it's really nice to see you all. It's nice to see a lot of familiar faces, yeah, we're really delighted to be back. As you were saying about all the moaners in Cannes, we it's not that we ever moaned about having to do this, no, but we're really thrilled to be having a discussion again. It's been a really difficult period for all of us, I know. So originally, when we started doing this gig, it came out of this introduction to this review called the Studios Irlandais. I was asked to write a kind of review of the year in Irish cinema, and that was quite manageable when that started out. You could sort of pick dominant tendencies. There was probably a major film or two or maybe three, and you could kind of sum it up, and away you went, and maybe articulate a kind of a direction or a tendency. We met Niall early on in that kind of journey, and Niall took a much more scientific base, and we sort of ended up leaning on him a little bit later on in terms of his statistical analysis of the industry and so on. And then that sort of, I would tend to go more with textual or cultural kind of ideas, and Roddy would then come in with sort of policy shifts and changes. All that by way of saying that kind of manageability has become very, very, very difficult to do. Now, it may be partly because of the slippery, amorphous quality of the COVID experience. And as you'll see, when I was going through the kind of releases and so on, it's very difficult to know when something's coming out, when it was released. And partly that's to do with COVID, but only partly. Has that to do with that. So there's films that I'll mention that have actually 2019 as their production date, but 2021 as a release date, and even then the release is kind of partial. So in trying to do this job for this year, it became quite, as I say, amorphous and a bit slippery because of the 2 years we've been through and a kind of build up of releases, but also clearly because of the acceleration of certain tendencies within cinema globally by COVID. And of course, by that I mean streaming and new patterns of distribution, release, exhibition, circulation. And so it becomes increasingly difficult to kind of trap what's happening. and where you build your box and your boundaries and so on. And I'm looking forward to hearing what Ruth might want to say about those things, since Ruth kind of, you know, was at the forefront of the notion of a national cinema and the notion of a coherent, you know, thing that you could put in a box and you could say certain things about, whether that was about thematics or politics of representation or policy, industrial policy and so on. Anyway, so that's a kind of a proviso or an initial comment. The notion of the shifting amorphous quality of the thing we call Irish screen industries. So thinking about this, I guess the concept that may hold it together is the concept of the audience. And you know, as I say here, like who, what, and where are those audiences? Maybe the audience is the grounding kind of concept that would help us to talk about older ideas like what is national cinema, and so on, and also allow us to talk about the economics of distribution, self-distribution, platformization, and so on. Because of course it's audiences really rather than audience, where there was a presumed audience at one point. There are now multiple audiences, or multiple presumed audiences actually. Whether those audiences are there or not is also open to question. And indeed, as I was saying to Roddy last night, a really good research project would be to try to find out where the audiences are and who the audiences are and if the audiences exist indeed. But it's probably too early to try and do that now. But like working your way through the releases of the last year and trying to find out the platforms that various films were released on, you know, we started off doing that. You know, we could find that, you know, a film had 9 outlets, but after that, it's very, very difficult to find out, and none of them theatrical, for instance. So maybe audiences is the kind of core concept that allows us to be both local and global, that allows us to be both specific and general in the way we think about these things. So I'll finish with just this slide, of course, as the kickoff point and what will be our end point. Because this film seems to conform to the audience as we knew it before COVID. In a strange way, this is a return, and it's a comfort. It's hugely celebrated, hugely enjoyed, hugely discussed. It's become a currency of cinematic conversation in a way that almost nothing else has since before COVID. So I think part of the success of this film has been a re-establishment of a coherent audience amongst us. And that gets expressed in financial terms, box office terms, a kind of a barometer that may be old-fashioned or already outdated, but at least one that we understand, and one that seems to reflect back to us the concept of a national or a local cinema, and more importantly, and perhaps more hearteningly, the notion of a national or local audience, which we can consider ourselves part of. So I'll come back to those ideas at the end.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. So, I mean, what's interesting about Colleen Kuhn is I mean, the funny thing you're getting at there is that this is a film that has not as yet been released and up to direction on platforms, right? So this is it's had a cinema release exclusively, and is by some distance the most successful Irish film for half a decade, I suspect, in the cinemas. Because like a couple of, when we started doing this, I was assuming that we'd be talking about Deadly Cuts. This has got, I think, 10 times the business or something like that of what Deadly Cuts did in the cinema last year. So it is a kind of, so it's taken 400,000 euros after 3 weeks, which is, I can, yeah. So I can much louder.
Thanks. We're craning back.
Can you hear me in the back? Sorry. So it's taken 400,000 or thereabouts, I think, over the last 3 weeks or so, which is pretty astonishing for an Irish film, full stop, let alone for an Irish language film. But a theme that we kind of will want to keep coming back and thinking about audiences is, I guess, it's kind of identified by these ball stats here. So this is like how Irish film did this year, okay? But this is from a production perspective, not so much from an audience perspective. And back in 2018, we had the Audiovisual Action Plan. This is still basically the official Irish government policy, which said in 5 years' time, we can have an industry here worth $500 million. And it's probably the only time in my 30 years of looking at Irish film policy where 5 years on, they have an industry worth $500 million. Fair play to them. There you go, job done. We can all go home. Screen production last year worth just over $500 million, spread across, you see the various projects here, 24 animation projects, 21 feature films, 10 television dramas, and 12 documentaries. And you can get some sense of actually just the scale of these things, the relative average kind of prices that go into these things. So the television dramas obviously are much more expensive than even the feature films. But the feature films come in at about $8 million kind of on average per budget. The television dramas is $22.4 million, so quite a lot more. But my point in showing you this actually is not to kind of emphasize these figures; it's to emphasize the lack of figures actually that we would have about consumption. Because it has to be something like Colleen Kuhn and a distributor kind of actively, promoting its success through tweets for us to have some sense of how these films do. Because as Tony says, most of them disappear. I mean, we'll touch on some of them. There's probably 40 Irish features of some class or another that has come out in some form or another in the last year or so. We're going to maybe mention 5 of them or 6 of them. We might show pictures of other ones. And the truth is, I've got no clue how most of those things performed because they, especially last year, they will have appeared on platforms. An increasing variety of platforms, some of which I only heard of because I was looking for the films. I'd never heard of the platforms before. But this is, I suppose, increasingly our sense of kind of, the problem of the audience, like where the audience lies, and maybe the impossibility, without maybe starting to do some kind of ethnographic research where you sort of sit people down in a room and go, where did you see this film and what difference did it make? And actually, I was thinking about this in terms of deadly cuts, just as a kind of personal anecdote. My wife and kids saw it in the cinema and they loved it. Thought this was great crack. I saw it on a train from Galway on this, and I didn't, I'm afraid. I thought it didn't really land for me. And I thought, well, that's because that's who I am, that's who they are, whatever, and that's the academic and all that stuff. But then it occurred to me, they saw it in the cinema with loads of people around them. When stuff was funny, people laughed. I was kind of going, come on a train. I was always, and that thing on a train, you're a bit awkward, kind of, because you don't want to be laughing too loud. But so it matters, not just so how we consume this stuff really does matter, and therefore understanding how stuff is consumed matters as well. But I'm just going to kind of do kind of the financial bit first off, and kind of talk about in some respects where on a financial level the center of gravity lies with Irish cinema. And even that term cinema I should be careful of, with Irish screen production, because I think that's probably more, it's just getting harder and harder to make those distinctions between stuff that appears on a screen that size or a screen that size and a screen of this scale. So some just kind of points to observe on a on a sort of a broader basis. Everywhere has had a problem, right across Europe with COVID, obviously, over the last couple of years. Cinema audience or cinema revenues plummeted. They are starting to come back, although oddly enough, looking at figures for the UK and Ireland last year, and Ireland, despite notionally being the most cinema-going kind of country in Europe, has actually been the slowest to recover in terms of going back to cinemas. In part, I suspect, because our lockdowns were just that bit much longer than, say, the UK. But I suppose there is a question of whether things are changed irrevocably. Have we just shifted to the smaller screen because of the experience of watching stuff at home over the last kind of 2 years? And so we have, if you look at kind of the visions that have been offered by the European Audiovisual Observatory, they see things in two perspectives. One is this, or they're looking at the industry in two perspectives. One is the way that I think we have probably been doing up to this point, going, what is it worth as an industry from a production perspective? How much money is being invested into the production of these things? But as I say, what we want to try and do a bit more of is try and see it more from an audience and consumption kind of perspective. So I won't dwell on the details of this stuff. But we do find it interesting that we've been looking at, I look at policy stuff. So I've been reading back over the Irish Film Board's last couple of strategy documents. This is the most recent one at the cover, the most recent one. Here are the strategic objectives. I'm going to focus on the one in the middle here, the one about audience. But it's interesting to compare what this document is saying. So this is covering up to 2024 with the previous document. So that's from the strategic plan from 2016 to 2020. And there is a marked there's two orientations I think which have shifted. One, the assumption that cinema, the big screen, is the space where stuff is going to be consumed, is no longer nearly as prevalent. Now it's just talking about, it's about finding audiences, right? It's not about finding films on screens. There's still a stress. If I go back actually to this document, just go back to the previous one. Thank you. There is still a stress on kind of supporting cinemas, getting people back into cinemas. Colleen Kuhn demonstrates the value of seeing stuff in cinema. That platform is going to increase the value of that film, obviously, when it comes to sales into ancillary markets, whenever they do a deal with a streaming platform, whoever that might be. But moving on to the next one again, the focus now is finding audiences, and also finding audiences outside Ireland, which is a really significant shift, I think. So this is from the 2024 document. This is from the 2016 document, and the focus here on global audiences, so not just audiences, but finding global audiences able to enjoy culturally rich Irish screen stories through collaboration with screen partners. Now, how does this guy come in? This is the difficulty. The thing I actually really want you to look at here is not Tom Cruise so much as this date here, right, May 27th. And I was listening to, an American podcast from the Hollywood Reporter, and they were talking about the performance of this, and the concern that Tom Cruise, who God love him, has never had $100 million opening weekend, astonishingly in his career, despite being the most bankable actor over the course of 3 decades. And kind of will this be the one? And the main concern wasn't competition from other movies that might be released, but from these things, right? Which, as it happens, May 27th, an image is missing, but there it goes, May 27th. So on streaming platforms, Obi-Wan Kenobi is expected to be even bigger than Mandalorian for Disney Plus, and Stranger Things also coming out at the same time. Now, I'm sure you'll all be relieved to know that Tom Cruise has had $100 million opening. And I think we can all be delighted. $124 million over 3 days, which is pretty good, on a 4-day weekend with the bank holiday in the States. So, a lot of relief there. But the concern was sort of who goes to see this film, right? Is this basically the people who watched Top Gun in the 1980s? People who are basically look like this, right? Who are in their late 40s, early 50s, who maybe dragged their complaining 13-year-old along because honestly this was amazing. Whereas the 13-year-old really has probably already consumed this in its entirety, or as much of it as they could already, and a good part of this already. So there is, this is the question we're kind of grappling with. Is there just that kind of that shift in the center of gravity towards this kind of space? The other thing, coming back to the Irish kind of production sector, looking at it from this perspective, is just to acknowledge the real significance of those streamers within the Irish production ecology. These are the kind of that $500 million, right? That didn't come from domestic Irish Indigenous feature production. That won't come as too much of a surprise to you. It didn't even come from Irish television drama, although that's kind of bulked up. I'm assuming most of these are broadly familiar. The fact that these things exist to do it in front of me, but just so what we have. So we have Apple TV's Foundation, the single largest production ever made in Ireland, going on in Troy. You have Disney's follow-up to Disenchanted, which, okay, strictly speaking, is a movie and isn't for a streamer, but it's going to end up on Disney Plus, and I suspect it's going to be crucial to their marketing effort in the coming year. And the rest of it is all direct, basically streamer stuff. So we've got Valhalla for Netflix. We have My Little Pony movie, which is also made in Ireland for Netflix. Modern Love, second season of it, John Carney's Modern Love, second season of it seems to have been partially at least shot in Ireland. I'm not entirely sure where, but
it was shot primarily in Dublin, and then they did a train sequence between Dublin and Galway, but that was actually shot in the studio.
Oh, okay, right. So I saw some of those stills. I thought, where is that Connolly Station? Or
it's meant to be a train journey from Dublin to Galway, but what they did was they strapped GoPros to the outside of the train and then did the entire scene in-house with virtual production. So
as you do. Okay.
Was that because of COVID, Niall, was it, or was it because
because it allowed them to rewind the train journey?
No, I mean because was it all shot here because he can now, or because of COVID? Do you think?
No, it was both. It was,
Yeah, they weren't allowed to shoot on the train during COVID.
Okay,
Okay. Anyway, we've got Fate, the Winx saga. anyone's interested in this kids show for Netflix. Moonhaven, which I haven't even heard of, to be absolutely honest with you, but for AMC. I haven't put in 4 others. I sent this in a text to Tony yesterday. Have you heard of any of these? Magpie Murders, Rig 45. I can't even remember the other 2. Also for streamers. Never heard of them. Shot here last year. Quite big productions based on the amount of Section 481 funding that seems to have drawn down. So that's where the kind of money goes. And I also just wanted to make the point actually about how this is true. I mean, the point about these is that these are not made for Ireland, right? These are international productions. And we sometimes kind of gloss over animation just a little bit. But I've been talking to a couple of people working in animation at the various studios in Dublin recently. And just what comes across is the extraordinary outward orientation of these. These are just the kind of the top current hits of brown bag films. Cartoon Saloon, we think of Wolf Walkers, we think of the Oscar nominations, but the bread and butter is the TV series. So it's Puff and Rock very well. 2 more I don't know: Viking School, City Sundays, Tellegale, which has single-handedly drawn down more Section 481 money, not in absolute terms, but in number of projects, largely for animation projects. I don't think of Tellegale's animation company, but it seems to be actually a very large part of what it actually does. So. This is, and again, these are all, nearly all, I think, for streaming platforms, for the Netflixes, for the Disney Pluses, for the Apples of this world, for the Amazons again of this world. And I just thought, I know this is not really strictly speaking about television or focusing on film, but just to talk about the implications of all this for like what gets kind of produced locally. Here's the stuff that is local. Right, so this is RTE's auto schedule for last year. So we've Kin, we have Hidden Assets, and we have Harry Wild, which I'm not sure not too many people would have seen this. It was a part of RTE's schedule in the last 6 months. I think it came out after Christmas. So it's Jane Seymour, she's the mother of a Dublin detective, don't ask, who becomes a detective in her own right. But all of these exist because of AMC. American Movie Classics, the cable station, which is now primarily a streamer through AMC Plus and through Acorn TV. Acorn TV has put more money into Irish television drama, I suspect, in the last 5 years than any other single entity. And all of those shows are funded by AMC indirectly, either through AMC Plus or through Acorn TV. So Kin, obviously set in Dublin and in Belgium, I think it's in Brussels. Hidden Assets, rather, in those 2 countries. Harry Wild has a kind of international dimension to it. Kin, both of these are made by Peter McKenna, guy who created Red Rock, kind of a graduate of the BBC's script training program. And it was a really interesting interview with him back in October last year, which, in fact, I think I might even be able to find the quote, but he really straightforwardly says it doesn't matter how this performs in Ireland. Like it literally doesn't matter. It has been produced with one main goal in mind: to be successful in the United States. Success in Ireland won't deliver enough money to keep it going. So there's a larger point here about the kind of the production ecology of broadcasting in Ireland. The national broadcaster is unable basically to sustain material off its own bat, with the exception of Fair City. If this stuff doesn't work, internationally, it's not going to happen at all. And that's where our television drama that even speaks to us basically is coming from. So that's the kind of gloomier side of all this stuff. Lots of international stuff, and even the stuff that is local has to speak to audiences outside Ireland. It has to make sense to audiences outside Ireland. Good one.
So, so Ireland as setting then, often slightly disguised in TV, often explicit, and we see sort of tail end of some of these Ireland as setting tendencies. In these 2 films, there was huge brouhaha about Wild Mountain Time. The funny thing about trying to write a synopsis of Wild Mountain Time, because I couldn't figure out, having watched it twice, what happened in it. Something flowers and John Hamm. But an End of Sentence, I don't know if anyone's seen End of Sentence. It's quite good, actually. But it uses Ireland in the way that, these films in the immediate post-war period use them, Franny. As a kind of an idyllic space, a space, as I call it, of white fantasy, and you still get that in American productions, but also in European productions. So it becomes a kind of a de-ethnicized space, a space out of time and out of place, and almost always a space of romance and a space of reinstatement of traditional values, be they racial, heteronormativity, and so on. So Ireland still gets used in that way in those films. But not all films use Ireland in quite that way. And in the last year, we've seen quite a number of co-productions in particular use Ireland as a horror space. So that's kind of interesting too. It's kind of the other way in which Ireland is often used. Not so much as a safe space for heteronormative whiteness, but as a space of menace or threat. This draws on all kinds of other associations, of course, mythical and otherwise. But there's kind of interesting things that can be pulled out of these too. And if you did again, this is tied to this concept of the audience. In other words, these are for international audiences with expectations of what Ireland might mean as a shorthand for a pre-modern space or so on. But one of the things that's interesting about if you did a bit more work on the horrors is how Ireland functions. So in this one, The Winter Lake, we get a mother and a son coming back to Ireland, where they sort of uncover a kind of a hidden secret. And what was the name? The Hollow. What was the Hollow? The Hollow, yeah. But there was that other film. Do you remember Ken, years ago? Kelly Riley was in it. Do you remember that one?
Nicholas Rogue?
Yeah, Nicholas Rogue film.
Oh, Puffball.
Puffball, yeah. So there's an interesting essay to be written about that notion of coming back to Ireland, return immigrants or people who had some ties, or this one here, The Green Sea, Randall Plunkett's film, about a young woman who comes to write her second novel and then encounters a sort of chilling child character. Another thing that's interesting about a lot of the films that get made here this year is there's so many first-time writer-directors. Actually, there's a kind of an unusually high number of first-time writer-directors, and that may be a blip in terms of the COVID funding and finance and so on. But certainly, Ireland works as a space to kind of try out genre ideas. And there's other things to say here, maybe, which is that if Ireland is kind of functioning as a kind of shorthand for something, it's very often in the company of actors who have achieved a degree of fame or notoriety on the streaming platforms. Both of these films are the case. So there's, again, this kind of appeal to an international audience and genre audience. This film was interesting. John writes Unwelcome in that it's set in Ireland, but not a second of it takes place. It's actually shot in Ireland. It's actually a totally almost virtual Irish. It's all shot in studio. But again, Ireland functions as a kind of a shorthand here, and again, it's aimed at an international genre audience. So what of the films that were produced then after all that? The things that we might point at usually or have been able to do in the past, the feature film, the feature film as a kind of barometer of the Irish screen industry, as I think we're kind of trying to suggest is, it's increasingly tenuous, as it's a very small part of it, the Indigenous produced feature film, and yet it is the place where that will attract most scholarly attention and most commentary in newspapers and magazines and in the national media. It still retains its status as the kind of central pillar of what we might call the Irish screen industries. Going through sort of the films that were released last year, and as I say, I'm aware that some of these may seem a little bit older than just last year, but they did all get a release last year. I've sort of hit upon kind of by accident, two slides, one which is like the boy films and the other which was the girl films, that there is kind of an interesting kind of breakdown in gender themes, and arguably in terms of personnel as well. So this is the boy slide in a sense. And And we could talk about these all if you like a bit more. I suppose what I want to say about them is the redemption of a rogue I've put in the middle might stand as the theme of all of them, you know, in a sense. That redemption is striking as a kind of a theme that's attached to male characters, and not just male characters, but young white male characters. So there's, you know, the films are about, and this is a space we've been in previously and perhaps have never got out of, but that young Irish white male going through some kind of struggle in search of some kind of redemption, you know, retains its status as a kind of favored theme. It's a fairly narrow kind of demographic. And as you can see, these are all, well, the one on the left and the one on the right, you know, are genre kind of films. The one on the right here, The Young Men, kind of an interesting film set in Ireland. Only one of the actors is Irish. Some of the background actors, again, you know, aimed really at a Netflix global audience. Yeah, a film which draws on kind of vocabularies of international cinema and really strikingly and quite deliberately tries to reach out to that global audience. The strongest kind of Irish character in the film is Anya Taylor-Joy's character, actually, which is sort of surprising, and she's really excellent in the film. Redemption of a Rogue is really great fun, and I really liked it a lot, actually. And it's really anchored by this Aaron Monaghan character, and it sort of, you know, it draws on the kind of Bog Gothic traditions, but again, it has this sense of males struggling against sort of supernatural or otherworldly forces, and there's a kind of moral dimension to this. There's often gender politics involved in this, and so there's a kind of a moral universe that these men inhabit, but it's not a realistic one. Is the point I wanted to kind of make. And then the second slide, which was you know, 3 sort of major films, and what's I think more striking about these films compared to the previous films is that, first of all, they all center on female protagonists, and you know, draw on female talent behind the camera in considerable fashions, but all are sort of located in much more realistic and tangible worlds, and deal with, I would suggest, much more psychologically rounded, credible, and identifiable characters. And I mean, you don't want to offer a kind of a generalization, but that is a generalization I can see between these two kind of strands of filmmaking. And these 3 films are really interesting. I would suggest in very interesting social kind of ways, whether it's about questions of domestic abuse and yourself and homelessness, whether the intergenerational traumas of Northern Ireland and so on, really interestingly explored, and that, or the notion of paternity and issues of feminine identities. These were terrific films, and really heartfelt and worked out over a long period with real seriousness about them. Quick glance towards nonfiction features, 3 really interesting and really quite different documentaries, all concerned with men and music. So make of that what you will. But I mean, I saw Breaking Out a long time ago at the FLA, but it got a release finally. So Love Yourself Today, was a revelation. I don't know if anyone managed to catch up with that. I became a Damon Dempsey fan and bought tickets to the gig, and I that was extraordinary. And Phil, and again, I think we could, if we had the time, and maybe we will, to unpack what kinds of men are featured in these, and how these men are explored in different ways, and how music helps shape our understanding of these masculinities. And each of them are vulnerable in some way, and each of them, I guess, highlight questions of male vulnerability in some ways, which makes them distinctive. And then finally, in this kind of nonfiction thing, I think it would be remiss not to draw attention to kind of more experimental artist-based cinema. I call them out of character because these are films which are interested in film, are interested in process in different ways. And I'm sure you've seen at least 1 or 2 of these, all of them very enjoyable. The Evening Redness there is perhaps the least well known, but it's kind of a reworking of the silent film kind of genre. So I want to finish then by returning to this notion of the national audience, to go back after Roddy sort of took us through the notion of the global, unidentified kind of streaming audience, and how we sort of saw how that had shaped some films made here. I want to finish then with this enormous press coverage and national attention through media and discussion to the Irish language stuff. That's everywhere. And, an interesting little project would be just to collect the newspaper cuttings and the articles that have been written on this topic. Here, for example, is one from the Financial Times. And Mullally has something to say there. And then a tweet grab. Anyone else feel there's an Irish cultural revival brewing? And I thought that was a sweet kind of a tweet because it seemed to me to want an Irish cultural revival to be brewing. A lot of people piled in after that. Irish language having a moment in the sun, and Nuala Mullally's shame and derision that strangled the Irish language seems to have evaporated. And again, this is an enormous conversation. Why is that? How did that happen? And why didn't it come along sooner? But I'll say very quickly just a couple of things about what's at the base of that. And of course, as you know, it is the Sine Cahir scheme, which was launched as far back as 2017. And I think it's kind of worth sort of underlying that. This is not something that just happened yesterday. This is actually 5 years in the works. And so far, the Sine Cahir scheme, as you know, has produced 4 films, or 5 films: Finky, Arat, Fosca, Roche Agus Frank, and Colleen Kuhn. And Dinon is another film, but it's actually not part of that scheme. It's a Northern Irish scheme as well. Now, I've seen all of these films. They're all very enjoyable. And as I say, they seem to have achieved what you would want from your national cinema in terms of its kind of critical and audience success and profile. They are unquestionably local in their settings, in their themes, and as you all know, in their language. They provide long-sought responses to anxieties about the demise of the language, and they therefore seem to fulfill the ambitions and needs of an Irish national cinema at a time of intense globalization in other areas of indigenous production. So they seem to offer the best of both worlds. They seem to compensate in a certain sense for these other, not compensate, but offer a balance too, if you like, the growth in the production sector, and at the same time offer a reassuring retooling of the notion of a national cinema, a space that probably would have been taken up by the likes of Jim Sheridan and so on and so forth back when. I want to finish by just making a couple of very short generalizations on the back, just sort of a reflection at this point in time. Now, that scheme runs 2 films a year, so this will be mutating and changing. But just on the basis of the films that we've seen so far, 2 slides of quick reflections. All of these films blend, I think, elements that look to the past and to the future in search of expressing a contemporary moment. And I don't have time to go through each one of them, but in all of them, we obviously have elements of the past, which is the language, largely rural settings, and story or origins. That is to say, when I say past here, I mean origins in Irish writers. So there's elements that are I would maybe past is the wrong word, tradition, maybe this kind of sense of tradition. All of them, the settings of all of these films is really quite interesting. Recent or distant past. Fosca, when does Fosca take place exactly? Finky, this kind of steampunk thing, when does it, there's an uncertainty. Obviously, Colleen Kuhn, most of you will have seen, is clearly very demonstrably set as particular, and Arat, of course, So the past plays a big role in these films to a greater or lesser extent, or put it another way, the present doesn't play. And the other thing that I note by all of the characters, and which is quite striking, and if you've seen 2 or 3 or 4 of these films, you'll notice that most of the characters are marked by trauma or some sense of separation, that they have been pulled away from something, whether in Arat, it's the daughter and the homeland and so on and so forth. Fosca, if you've seen that, it's about a boy who's been left alone after his parents die. Finky, it's to do with a child that has gone away. And Colleen Kuhn, you know yourself. So it's striking that all of these films deal with kind of the same theme, albeit in quite different ways. But on the other hand, these films don't feel like they're mired in the past in the way that we go, oh, not another John McGahern. Poor old John McGahern. The talent is new, fresh-faced, handsome, dynamic. And actually, people better qualified than me might think about acting styles in these films. It's not theatrical, it's quite cinematic. The aesthetics of the films is striking. It's really of a high quality and standard. Colleen Kuhn in particular is a great example of what film studies people call haptic cinema, where it sort of looks and textures and moments and it evokes kind of atmospheres in the most skillful, incredibly skillful way. Finky is extraordinary in its kind of ambitions in terms of its set design. Arat, as you know, really simple, that beautiful Cape Color cinematography. Really, again, simple and not overcooked. So these are very sophisticated pieces of work, which feel, for all their attachments to tradition, incredibly modern, actually. And that's a striking quality of them. They all feature newer kind of masculinities, marked by regret, kindness, a desire for love, a desire for healing. Think of Finky if you've seen that. Think of Arat. Think of Colleen Kuhn in a different kind of a way. I'm thinking of the foster father in that film. But all of them are marked. The father figure in Colleen Kuhn, since that's the one that's kind of, is striking in his non-conformity to traditional representations of rural masculinity. He is a good man. And that is a rare thing, for a farmer figure. He's a kind man. And you can see this all the way through. Finky is a demented, deranged kind of a film, but at its heart is a hurt man. And that, I think, is striking. And then finally, the past and the present intersect in the prominence of children in these narratives. All of these films, in some way or other, center around a child. And I find that striking. Now, it's a lot to put all that weight on a group of random kind of films that happen to be randomly chosen from a bunch of scripts. But it is striking, these similarities, nonetheless, that seem to produce something that sits on the edge of past and present, that pivots on it. And so what I want to suggest then is that this is a policy intervention from 5 years ago that actually feeds a post-pandemic desire for a sense of continuity and community amidst a moment of trauma and uncertainty. It is, in fact, a looking back in order to look forward. And in that sense, I think these films meet their audience exactly where that audience needs them. So I'll leave it there.